Hello and welcome everyone. Today we will be talking about Adam Smith. Adam Smith is hailed as one as laying the foundations for capitalism. And although a task on political economics might be tedious to some of you, others of you will find this tremendously interesting. And it is important to reflect on the relationship between the state and the economy. Today, capitalism is the dominant mode of economic production. But this has not always been the case. Until the fall of the Soviet bloc, there was at least one other contender about how we should rule or how we should govern our economies, being the socialist mode of production. And now most of our economies today will have integrated some elements to a lesser or greater extent of both these economic theories. Calling them an economic theory is of huge importance as it will show that, like any other theory, they're valuable, limited, and abstract versions of ideas. So, capitalism, or the theory that we'll talk about today in Smith, being a theory also means that it's not the answer, or that you cannot criticize it by just the fact that it is the most dominant um, way of organizing and setting up our economies nowadays does not mean that it's therefore automatically perfect. And in that regard, it's interesting to look at some aspects in capitalism. So, first of all, granted, with the introduction of more market economies, most people have lived longer, are healthier, and are more wealthy than they have ever been. Yet, at the other hand, when competition is crowned king and winning is the name of the game, how much room is there still left for ethical businesses? Or has our global economic system become so complex and competitive and focused on efficiency that there is no longer room for morality and human sympathy in the conduct of economics and running businesses? And while capitalism indeed raises absolute levels of prosperity, at the same time we see a growing divide and ever larger getting divide between rich and poor. In the light of this, how free is the free market then actually? It is questions like this that will make the study of political economics interesting and relevant. And today we'll focus on Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand and the functioning of markets. This idea can be found in his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations. However, it's a pity that this text is often read alone, as Adam Smith wrote another influential work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And this theory is basically Adam Smith's moral work, and that can put the sometimes coming across cold or cold-hearted and efficiency-oriented ideas which laid the foundations for capitalism in Smith come across, can put them in a different perspective. And therefore, we will at the end of this talk spend a little bit or devote a little bit of time and attention to this second book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, as well. Well, that Smith had a major impact on today's economics is undeniable. We basically find rudimental forms of our most famous macroeconomic concepts within the first pages of The Wealth of Nations. He uses the annual labor of every nation to start his analysis, and this is basically our modern concept of GDP. Then he continues saying, this produce bears a greater or smaller proportion to the number of those who consume it, and ta-da, GDP per capita. The examples in this text are numerous. Smith employs all of these concepts to basically ask one question. How come that some nations are that much more affluent than others? You see that this question is a rather different one from most questions that we have taken up throughout this course or will take up throughout this course. But the whole text basically tries to formulate a coherent answer to this question. And this answer will depend on one big idea. How wealthy a nation becomes will depend on how it employs its labor. This element he then splits up into two different categories: the skill of labor and which proportion of the labor is usefully employed, in which the skill of labor tends to be the determining factor. So, how do we actually improve the productive power of labor? This is the central theme of Book 1, And for Smith, the answer is quite clear. The greatest improvement in productive powers of labor and the greatest part of skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. And he illustrates this division of labor with the example of making pins, when he claims that a single individual would have to make the whole pin by himself without the use of machinery would, with his utmost industry, make one pin in a day and certainly not 20. But if the process of making pins were broken up into different parts, one person drawing out the wire, another person straightening it, and even another one cutting it, and yet another one pointing it, and then a separate person securing the head onto the nail, all these divisions would become separate and individual trades, leading to an increase in productivity as they would, when they exert themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of middling size. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. But why does this division of labor and cutting everything up in small tasks, which everybody has to continuously repeat, actually lead to such a vast increase in output, right? Without division of labor, definitely not 20, but most likely one pin a day, and then 10 people working under a division of labor, producing 84,000 pins in a day. Well, this is due to three reasons, Smith observes. Firstly, there's an increase in dexterity in each particular worker if he only has to focus on one specific task. Secondly, there's less time lost in moving from one task to another. And maybe the most important element, which is the third element, is the invention of a greater number of machines, which facilitate one man doing the work of many when your tasks are very clear and precise. Because this increase in machine use, for Smith, parallels the division of labor, as when one laborer performs a multiplicity of tasks in the production process, he will favor all-round tools. Think about a carpenter who wants to create different kinds of furniture. He would want to have some general tools like a saw and a chisel, which are useful for shaping wood in all kinds of forms. But if you're occupied with one simple task, as straightening the wire when making the pins, for instance, you will want a tool that makes this specific element go a lot faster. So if a division or an increase in the division of labor, there will be an analogous diversification in tools and machinery used, which will speed up the overall process. So why does this division of labor actually occur now that we know that it increases our output? And note that for Smith this is a descriptive question, and he answers interestingly that it happens spontaneously. In chapter 2, he will say, this division of labor, from which so many advantages are derived, is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such excessive utility. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. What is important to note here is that it does not just happen spontaneously, but that it's not the product of human reason, or by extension, organized. The division of labor did not come into place by somebody saying, hey, I have a great idea. Wouldn't it be awesome if we divided everything up into little tasks and then we would be way more productive? It came about because something that we humans tend to just do. And we'll discuss this more in detail later when we talk about the invisible hand. But the interesting thing is that for the first time in Smith, we'll find a decentralized answer to an allocation problem. Whenever we had to deal with some form of allocation before, there would be the imposition of a central authority, which would tell us what to do, what wouldn't do, or constrain us in some regards. What Smith here says is actually if you just let people be and do without an overall pattern in mind, then division of labor will occur. So we don't need a philosopher king to tell us how to organize society. We don't need a Leviathan or prince forcing us to not give in to our inclinations and screw up. We should be left alone. Here we find a rudimental form, but this will become way more important when we move towards the invisible hand itself. But let's take a step back now. In which way is actually this entering into bartering or trade or commerce a certain propensity in human nature? Smith does not go into whether this propensity itself is a part of human nature or derived from natural human faculties like reason or speech, but what he points out is that we are able to put skill and abilities as humans under a common stock. Unlike animals, man sometimes uses the arts of his brethren, and when he has no other means of engaging them to act according to his inclination, endeavors by every servile and fawning attempt to obtain their goodwill. And the best way for actually obtaining another person's goodwill and thereby making use of the abilities of others is to try to interest their self-love in your favor and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires from them. Whoever offers another person a bargain of any kind proposes to do exactly this. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want, is the meaning of every such offer. So, what is inherently human is that we can pool our abilities or make use of the abilities of one another by making fair exchanges that appeal to both our interests. And this is why a division of labor in the end becomes possible. And importantly, this appealing to other interests is the human characteristic engaged into trade. And when we can trade, we can specialize because I don't have to do everything myself, but I can trade my surpluses for your surpluses and then both be better off. This leads him then to conclude in a famous passage that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but we talk of their advantages. Now, this is different from the behavior in animals that occasionally seem to cooperate, but actually don't. Animals can be seen as to cooperate when there is an accidental concurrence of their passions in the same object. They don't propose a trade or fairly divide something. And this distinction is important to keep in mind later when we talk about morality. So, trading is human, and once we engage in it, we will realize that actually focusing on one task, which we have established is more productive, right? We talked about division of labor, doing a small task is more productive, will make us all better off. And by this process, the division of labor slowly occurs. And an interesting observation is here that what determines your eventual occupation for Smith is not so much determined by being gifted. He actually doesn't think that that's what makes you good at something. He assumes us to be all quite equal in skill and ability. But actually, habit, custom, and education will determine what you will excel in. So you become good at something when you practice it enough, and not because you can't or can just do it. Keep this in mind when studying for a subject you really struggle with, and think, Smith tells you you can do it as long as you just keep going at it. So, what we have established now is that the division of labor is actually the cause of wealth in the affluent generations, and that the division of labor will spontaneously come about because people engage in trade and start to realize for themselves that it's more efficient if they focus on the production of one good and then trade their surplus with the surplus of somebody else. By extension, living in a community now becomes useful because there are more people to trade with. To lay out the rest of the argument, the part on wages and what they represent is not particularly relevant, but it's interesting if you want to look at some proto-Marxist elements present in his analysis. But for now, let's turn from book 1 to book 5. So when the division of labor is caused by trade that makes nations wealthy, what should a government then do in this context? Well, in the intro of book 5, we'll get this answer. Political economy, considered as a branch of science of a statesman or legislator, proposes two distinct objects. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. It proposes to enrich both the people and the sovereign. And in this regard, Smith observes something very interesting in chapter 2 of book 5. He says, as every individual, therefore, endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that it produce may be of greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was not part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he actually intended to promote it. Here we finally have it. Individuals, when pursuing their self-interest, are actually promoting the common good. So they are actually producing and making themselves and the sovereign affluent. And they are promoting this common good better when left alone or take care for their self-interest than when they would actually focus on wanting to promote the common good. Why? Well, this is where the invisible hand comes in. And the invisible hand directs patterns of individual rationality to a social pattern that promotes the common good. So first, let us delve deeper into this vague idea of an invisible hand and why free markets or decentralized planning can be said to be more efficient than central planning. For this reason, we'll have a look at Friedrich von Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society. And the main reason for why markets are more efficient, he will say, is that the data from which the economic calculus starts are never for a whole society given to a single mind which could work out the implications and can never actually be so given. So markets for Hayek will perform better than any kind of planned or centralized economy because the information that's relevant for economic decision making is never given to a single mind in a society or experts in a society as a whole, and this information cannot so be given. Because the relevant economic information is the knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place, which for Hayek is a kind of knowledge in opposition to scientific knowledge on general rules. So every individual has in this regard some particular and unique advantages, as he proposes a unique set of information of time and place relative to his environment. But this knowledge can only be fully utilized if the decisions are left to this one individual. Why these two forms of knowledge, so the particular knowledge and the scientific knowledge, are distinct, and what constitutes the problem for any kind of central planning economy is that this particular knowledge of time and place cannot be translated into statistical aggregates. The flow of goods will remain constant even when factory A fails to deliver, but factory B steps in, or when it's got the word for it, steps in and increases its output. But the very important regulating factor here is that actually B has the particular knowledge which makes him adjust his output in the light of knowing that the neighboring factory A has failed to deliver. And this specific process underlies all the aggregate flows of goods. But it's crucial information that is cancelled out when looking at it. We just see a production of so much, but it was actually managed to be stable because B stepped in when A failed. And it's these small constant changes and reacting and adapting to that, Hayek says, which you do based on knowledge of a particular circumstance, which you'll not find in statistical aggregates, but that constitutes the crucial element of what it is, what we do when we engage into economics. So, if we can agree that the economic problem of society is mainly one of rapidly adaptation to changes in a particular circumstance of time and place, it would seem to follow that the ultimate decision must be left to the people who are familiar with these circumstances. Or said plainly, we can only run an economy optimally if we can rapidly adjust on the basis of all this particular knowledge possessed by every individual. And this is only possible if we leave them the freedom to act upon this. Inversely, central planning does not work because the monitoring of aggregates is unsuitable, or gathering all the relevant information, then informing the central authority, then making a decision, and then communicating the decision back to the people on the spot will have so many inefficiencies that the particular situation might have already changed before the decision reached the people who were supposed to act upon it. But we have to go one step further. Yes, decentralized systems leave the man on the spot so that he can act promptly, but why does this mean that he has the information to make the right kind of choices? Right? We just said that there were problems with translating everything to or like giving all the relevant information to the central authority, but at least that central authority would have had all the information. And if this particular individual only has particular knowledge about his circumstances in place, how does he know that he has to collect the relevant information at all to make a right call? Right? This leads us to the question of how much knowledge does the man on the spot actually need to not just act promptly, but also to make the right decision? Well, if we go back to our previous example between the two factories, Factory B doesn't need to know everything. He doesn't need to know why Factory A failed to deliver, like whether it was a power shortage, or the employees were sick, or there was something wrong with the delivery. The only relevant information is how much Factory A failed to deliver, so that B could step up and increase its production accordingly. Or only these how much questions, as in how urgent, or like how much output I need to produce, or how much profit there is to make, only these questions are relevant when engaging into economic decision making. Or as Hayek would put it, it's always a question of relative importance of the particular thing with which he is concerned, and the causes which alter their relative importance are of no interest to him, beyond the effect on those concrete things in his own environment. And it is exactly this kind of information that a price system, if left to freely fluctuate, conveys. Because by attaching to each kind of scarce resource a numerical index which cannot be derived from any property possessed by that particular thing, but which reflects or in which it is condensed, its significance in the view of a whole means and structure. In any small change, he will have to consider only these quantitative indices or values in which all the relevant information is concentrated, and by adjusting the quantities one by one, he can appropriately rearrange his disposition without having to solve the whole puzzle ab initio. So we don't need this intervention of a central planner to have the right information to base our decisions on. We just need to have the information which is summarized in the price of a product. And the advantage of this decentralized market economy is then that we can act promptly and that we have the relevant information to make the right decisions. So the invisible hand directs individual interests to a common good because the market, which functions decentralized and is based on the price mechanism, allows the individual to utilize all the relevant information available in a prompt way, which is to their individual interest, the profit, and to the overall interest of society, a higher economic output. Note that what Adam Smith praises here in particular and throughout the Wealth of Nations is a market economy. Because we can also look at it from the light of a central planning, which runs into a lot of problems, right? Because it doesn't have this information. And then it should not be surprising that Adam Smith will tell us on this question, what should the government do in economics? As he will say in at the end of this on chapter 2, every individual, for it is evident, can in his local situation judge much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him. This was not a fundamental insight into the operation of economies, but also an influential political idea. For with Locke we saw for the first time that a state was erected for the purpose of protecting property and advancing commerce. With Rousseau, we for the first time saw that people were put at the center of the notion of sovereignty. But Smith is much more radical in both of these aspects. States ought to strive for a prospering economy, its benefits, as it is to the benefit of the common, and this should be done by decentralizing and supporting the pattern that comes out of this decentralized interaction of people, basically meaning that the individual is set at the center of the concept of justice. So now that we are on the philosophy of science side a bit of Smith's reasoning, anyway, it might be interesting to also know what kind of explanation this invisible hand explanation actually is. Because how we now know how it functions, like how a market functions and everything, but what do we explain? How do we explain any real life phenomena by reference to a fictional entity like the invisible hand? Well, Nozick, in his Anarchy State Utopia, spent some time reflecting upon this. And for Nozick, these kinds of explanations show how some overall pattern or design, which one would have thought had to be produced by an individuals or groups' successful attempt to realize the pattern, instead was produced and maintained by a process that in no way had the overall pattern or design in mind. This makes the invisible hand explanation a particular form of what is called a fundamental explanation. And what fundamental explanations do is to explain a realm without reference to any concepts that belong to said realm. The attraction of these explanations is that we come to understand everything of that realm, since we don't need concepts which are already part of it. So, an invisible hand explanation minimizes the use of notions constituting the phenomena to be explained. In contrast to the straightforward explanation, they don't explain complicated patterns by fully blown pattern notions as objects of people's desires or beliefs. Invisible hand explanations of phenomena yield a greater understanding than those Others, as brought about by the design of the objects of people's intentions. It is therefore no surprise that they are more satisfying. So what they actually do is they don't explain why a particular distribution is desirable and then find reasons of how people's behavior could bring them about. Rather, they start on another level, which is the individual level and his behavior, and then explain what overall societal pattern emerges out of this behavior. And an example that might make this a bit easier to understand is basically evolution. So now we know that there are some random mutations in genes, and as it just happens, and that there are some random mutations in genes, and if these mutations will give some form of advantage, the prevalence of these genes in the gene pool increases. And this has given rise to our idea of a theory of evolution, but we don't have to mention the evolutionary process itself, or like the goal of evolving species and taking up niches in the process. It has a similar explanatory force as an invisible hand explanation, because what we basically do is we don't have to explain how we make the best overall economy. What we do is show what each person does best and reason what that pattern that produces, and then we find out that that is also the best pattern that is possible. It's these kind of explanations, fundamental explanations, that the invisible hand explanation as offered by Smith contains. And then for people who are interested in it, this would be an equilibrium form of a fundamental explanation. So, what does the invisible hand mean for the role of government in the economy? Because that was the question that we started out with in this part. It means that the sovereign is completely discharged from a duty. The duty of superintending the industry of private people and directing it towards the employment of the most suitable to the interest of the society. The government does not have to intervene into the economic system if it wants the economic system to function optimally. So we said at the beginning that we wanted to also dedicate some time to his theory of moral sentiments. And a good starting point for asking this question, is basically asking ourselves, why was Smith so concerned with the accumulation of wealth? Was he just greedy, or was there a more nobler goal? Well, not surprisingly for someone who was a professor in moral philosophy, there was more to why we need to focus on wealth of nations than just greed. We see an early element of the moral concern in the wealth of nations itself, as we see him writing, such nations, and there he talks about nations of hunters and fishers, however, are so miserably poor that from mere want they are frequently reduced, or at least think themselves reduced, to the necessity sometimes of directly destroying and sometimes abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted with lingering diseases to perish with hunger or to be devoured by wild beasts. While in thriving nations, a workman, even of the lowest and poorest order, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessities and conveniences of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. And the least we can get out of this passage is that there seems to be a concern with the condition of the poor in Smith, and that it's really necessary for nations to become wealthy and affluent, as that would make everybody better off in the absolute sense. Making more products also means that we have more to give to the poor or take care of the poor in society. So the reason for developing market economies is to improve the condition of the poor. Yet, is this good intention enough? We've learned that markets work so well because they rely on individual self-interest. But we've also learned from thinkers like Hobbes and Rousseau, for example, that acting upon our self-interest can have harmful consequences. It is self-interest that for Hobbes puts us into a state of war. and it's self-interest for Rousseau, which leads us away from establishing the general will and reflecting on the common good. Surely, the examples of rational economic self-interest leading to despicable conclusions are plentiful. One can think about climate change in this context, but I want to put another example to the real example to the foreground here. The model of the Ford Pinto that was produced in the 70s in the United States had a rear-end fuel tank that was prone to explosion upon rear-end collisions. So the Ford engineers were aware of this danger, but the company's executives had conducted a cost-benefit analysis and determined that the benefits of fixing it, which is a monetary estimate of the life saved and injuries prevented, were not worth the $11 per car that equipping it with a safer gas tank would have costed. For the estimate prevented injuries were 180 burn victims and 180 lives saved, plus which were valued at $200 million for a life and $200,000 for saving a life and $67,000 for each burn victim. Add the vehicle charge to that, the vehicle damage to that, and then the total benefit. So having 180 people die less, having 180 less burn victims because of the safer fuel tanks, would have had a benefit for the Ford executives of $49.5 million. But repairing the car, which costs $11 per car, for all 12.5 million cars produced, would have costed $137.5 million. So the company concluded that the cost of repair did not outweigh the benefits. In the light of such horrible events, how can Smith, as a moral philosopher, defend that we need to be self-interested and that our affluence or what we need to care for in our society actually comes from self-influence? Remember, it was because of the self-influence of the butcher, of the self-interest of the butcher that we expected our meal, not because of his humanity. Well, to get an answer to this, we have to look to Smith's concept of self-interest itself. And when we do so, we will find in the theory of moral sentiments that self-interest is actually a very broad notion for Smith. Self-interest is not only this cold economic rationality that was displayed in the Ford example, but it actually includes sympathy and mutual sympathy. And the idea of sympathy is at the core of Adam Smith's ethics. So what sympathy is for Smith is basically a form of empathy that has a judgment attached to it, or an evaluation of it. So Smith has a projectory account of this empathetic element, which means that we imagine how we would feel if we were in the other person's shoes. This, of course, is not identical to what that person will actually experience, but that leaves room on that we as humans strive for an ever closer picture of what other people feel, sharing our emotions as closely as possible, and reassess our positions in that light. So what's important then for sympathy is that we take this perspective of an independent spectator for Smith, which is close to a form of consciousness, but like a moral consciousness. But what we try to do is we bring our feelings as spectator into accordance with the agent in question. And we try to emphasize as long as possible that an impartial spectator can do. And then we actually make a moral judgment. This is based on our feelings as an impartial spectator. And a feeling, whether on the part of the other person motivated to make an action, or on the part of the person who has been acted upon by others, is worth of moral approval if and only if an impartial spectator would sympathize with the feelings. So we try to feel what the other one would We try to feel what the other person who's acted upon would have felt, and as long as we can sympathize with that position still, then it's a moral worthy act. If it's impossible to sympathize, as with the executives in Ford case, for instance, right, how could you have killed so many people over a bit of money, $11 per car, then it's a moral wrong. This is a very brief and very superficial idea of his point there, but it's enough to make the point for his idea of markets. As his notion of self-interest therefore includes this notion of sympathy, amongst other factors, interest itself is not a morally void concept for Smith. If the common good is reached based on self-interest, this therefore includes a moral attitude. So there needs to be a kind of moral attitude present when engaging into the economy and when engaging into markets, when you say that markets work based on self-interest for Smith. And remember here that we also mentioned that trade is a distinctive human characteristic, just like sympathy is a distinctive human characteristic. And remember that trade comes from our ability to make an appeal to the self-love of others, to even make an assessment of what others would love, or or how to appeal to the self-love of others. We need an account of empathy, and we need to know how to do that, what the other would like, what the other would appreciate. There is thus for Smith a sort of moral attitude which needs to be present to uphold market economies. Only in this case will markets eventually come to work for the common good. So Smith would be abhorred by the Ford Pinto example and not celebrate the efficiency that the Ford executives were able to attain as a result of their cost-benefit analysis. This moral theory also has an interesting complication for the Smithical state. As the state doesn't have to intervene in the economy, the state similarly should have a broad hands-off approach, as this kind of sympathy which is required cannot be fostered by any particular legislative agenda. It is really focused on our relationships to the people around us and respecting their feelings. And only individuals themselves can train their empathetic understanding of others. No laws can do this for you. Well, that's it for about Smith for today. So thank you for listening and see you again next time.